I'm Matthew Phelps, co-author of the Turning to God's Word Bible study, The Revelation of Jesus Christ, the Faithful Witness. Today we'll be talking about lesson 9 of our study, which covers the book of Revelation, chapter 8. We closed the last lesson on quite a bit of a cliffhanger. There's been multiple chapters of build-up around the scroll and these seals. And we got through 6, and then we paused. And then we talked about some other stuff, and now we're finally ready to see what the deal is. So we've been building up to this for a long time. If you're not reading carefully, it ends up looking very anticlimactic. Because, there was so much action around the opening of the 6, which makes it, on the surface, look like more is happening. But that may not necessarily be true. Think about creation itself, right? Happens in 7 days. And so much of the action of creation, in fact, all of it, happens in 6 days. And then you have a 7th day with a liturgical purpose that is also the point of all of the rest of it, right? And the culmination of all of the rest of it, and a much bigger deal, right? God resting and humanity being able to rest with God is the whole point. And the lack of activity is a bigger deal than all of the activity. This is that. Right down to this 7th seal is a liturgical function, right? It is very much a liturgical act. It very much and very deliberately mirrors the 7th day of creation. You have big build-up, lots of stuff happening, and then not. We also get, following the opening of the seal, when we bring out our next series of 7 in the form of trumpets, we get another very clear echoing, though not in order, of the activity of the days of creation, but in reverse, sort of. We'll talk about it. But clearly related. Stuff is happening to the things that occurred during creation, but only to a third. So we'll definitely work through some of that as we start blowing trumpets. But as we move into the activity here around these trumpets, we need to keep in mind that they're unleashed, so to speak, by the opening of this seal. So that what happens with the trumpets has to fall within the context of what happened with the seal. And that is a liturgical act. And that builds on a theme. If the book of Revelation could be said to have a single consistent narrative theme, which is a little bit of a stretch, but not too much, it is act of liturgy. Which is why it has been compared to the Mass, because our Mass is also an act of liturgy that pulls from liturgical acts in the Old Testament. The Mass and the book of Revelation have that in common, and so they bear a great deal of similarity. But I don't think the book of Revelation is intended to mirror the Catholic Mass so much as it's intended to mirror various liturgical acts of the Old Testament, which our Mass does. And so it's two things engaged in the same project in parallel that then necessarily end in a very similar place. It's really cool. And it tells us how important the liturgical celebrations of the Old Testament still are to us. The book started with liturgical items, right? You had lampstands that are things that are meant to be in the presence of the altar, right? We started with liturgical acts and items. The whole book is centered in and is anchored in. Heaven is described as mirroring the temple. Everything that we're talking about is rooted in the liturgical celebration of the Old Testament. So we have rich liturgical imagery imposed here throughout the book of Revelation, and that is kind of the unifying aspect of how we're pulling, of the puzzle we're putting together, right? That's what the picture is the worship of God. So we talked about, we're pulling all of these different pieces from the Old Testament and we're building a puzzle that's a new thing. That new thing is the worship of God. It's the function of liturgy. And so the more pieces we put together, the more liturgical this will look. So we start to see a lot of that come together more in this lesson than we've seen previously. And we will see it more still as we progress through the book. But this is kind of a strong turning point, which is what is intended with the breaking of that seal, right? That is a point of climax that we'll talk about more as we get into the text as well. But it's not an anti-climax. That really is a climactic point, a huge deal, and a turning point for the narrative of the book, as you expected it would be when we were building up. It's just not, we're used to action movies where the big exciting thing is like a big fight at the end and a lot of explosions. And when that's not what the build-up is to, you can miss that the build-up is still very much a crescendo when it culminates in a different thing. So we'll go through all the moving parts here. We'll talk about how the liturgy is being set up. But the key idea to keep in mind is this does culminate into an act of liturgy that does bring some more of those sorts of explosion things, but kind of secondarily to the greater purpose. Diving into the text then. The Lamb opens the seventh seal, and there is silence in heaven for about a half an hour. Few points. First, this is unusual. It's necessarily unusual, or it would go without comment. Heaven's not used to being silent, right? We've seen people praising God pretty constantly. The book does a great job. The written study does a great job. There's a box that goes into some of the detail here. You should always read all the stuff in the written lessons. It's very helpful. This one in particular has a lot of liturgical context that I'm not going to try to explain in great detail as we go through these videos, in large part because I'm afraid I'll mix it up. Because there are a lot of moving parts and it's less familiar to us because it's not the liturgy that we practice. There was routine time of silence as a daily act in the presence of the ark and then more broadly in the temple for a period of time. About a half an hour. So this thing it's movement, right? It's the priest in the presence of God. And Jesus, of course, popping that seal. And it is, in both cases, a form of reverence and a form of anticipation. And we alluded in the intro to the idea of mirroring some form of rest in the presence of God, as in the seventh day of creation as well, right? You have all of this activity and then you don't. And in many ways, that is more potent than all of the activity, even in creation, right? When it's all done and the workman rests from the act of creation of all of that work, there's a different feel to it, but it's not less than the act of creation, and in specifically in the Bible and in the seventh day of creation, it's more because that's what it was made for, right? Like the Catechism tells us the world was created for the sake of the church. That's the first act of church, is God resting and humanity resting with God. And jointly together, God and us, his creation, are together resting. That huge deal, right? And so when you go toward the presence of God in where the holiness is, be that in the temple or the tabernacle or heaven, less so the temple after God left, but they kept the forms after the ark. It's the same thing, right? It's joining in the same thing. We can unwind, right? We can stop being tense and stop doing and start being. That persists as an essential part of our relationship with God. It's not always about what you're doing for God or with God even. Sometimes it's about not that. Sometimes it's about being instead of doing. Is an essential, and that's the lesson of the Sabbath, right? And it's a thing we still keep and mandate. If you try to keep your Sunday Sabbath by doing a lot of things for God, like I've fallen into this trap myself. Like I should, read a bunch of religious books and pray a rosary and maybe write some reflections or something and think of all the holy things I should do for God as part of my Sabbath celebration, which is phenomenally missing the point. But it's an easy trap to fall into, right? The celebration of the Sabbath is one not for doing for God, but for being with God. And that's where this opening of the seal is so significant, because that's the thing we're moving toward. That's what we're trying to achieve, is being with God, right? After Jesus, we can be with God in heaven. And in a sense, we can participate in that union even here. But it's not the full sense, right? It's not God coming down. That's the whole thing we're trying to achieve, is humanity forever being with God and not so much doing with God. That's what the seals are promising to bring to us. So we get to this last seal and we take that breath, that pause to be with God as these things are happening. Of course, that's what should be happening at the end of these seals, because that's what's happening at the end of all of this forever. If you think about it, it makes perfect sense, but it's not how we think about the climax or the culmination of our faith enough, right? We think that the big climax of our faith is in what we're doing, and it's not. It is in being with God, with or without activity. And the fact that I'll say me, I won't speak for all of you watching. The fact that I still expect, even as I'm saying all of this, that the climax of all of this should be some great grand event is in part due to how we're used to narrative working, in part because of movies and things that we watch, and in part because it's really hard to get comfortable with the idea of just stopping and being in the presence of God. But that is the challenge here, right? For creation and for us individually, is to, as we look for growing and for a culmination of our relationship with God, the thing to do is nothing, and to be in the presence of God. And that's what's intended by a Sabbath celebration. That is an act of liturgy. It's a great fundamental act of liturgy. Before there was the Mass on the Sabbath day, there was rest. We added one thing that we do but that wasn't meant to supersede that you have the whole day of rest. Like, it's not meant to just be then, I went to Mass, Sabbath day, check. Well, you didn't do Sabbath when you went to Mass. You did something instead of not something. The Mass is important enough that it is a thing you're allowed to do on a day about not doing, which in itself is remarkable. The problem is, because we're so mindset-wise focused on what we're doing, that we think, oh, I did my thing for the day, so I'm done, right? Well, no, because you didn't do nothing with God yet. You did something with God. Great, do that, and please do that. You didn't yet do nothing with God. And if you go from church and you go out to lunch with your family and you come home, I don't know, do meal prep for the week or watch football games or whatever, do yard work. Taking a nap is a little bit better because, at least you're kind of doing nothing. But we fill our Sabbath day with things that we do. And where in that is there room for doing nothing with God? I'm not necessarily saying you have to do the whole day, although that's kind of the point. Try some. Pick a few hours around Mass, preferably after, because that's when you're with Jesus the most. If you come home from Mass, you don't have to cook or maybe do commerce to get food, and you have some kind of arrangement around food, or you can wait a while to eat. You get home and again, this isn't, I'm going to sit down and I'm going to read my Bible for a while, because that's, we try to do things to create relationship with God, right? It's how our minds work. It's how we're used to doing it. The trick is to not do that, right? This is not, doing nothing is such an interesting thing, because I'm not saying, right, you just have to sit on your couch in a meditative state for 2 hours and that's it, because that's so boring, at least for me. And it doesn't have to be that either, right? But it's hard to explain what I mean, because you can engage in some activity, but it should definitely not be anything you don't want to do. It shouldn't be anything that causes any kind of stress, and it shouldn't be anything that distracts you from the presence of God. Definitely not work in any capacity. Sure, is really debatable. The idea is to focus on presence of and union with God, and any activity you engage in that distracts from that, don't do. And that could be different from person to person, right? I love to cook, and I find it a very relaxing experience. I have no problem cooking on a Sabbath day. Maybe not with the TV on, right? Which I would do in a normal breakfast, but if I can just cook and focus on being in the presence of God, that can be a really cool Sabbath activity. I'm not doing nothing, but I'm not distracting myself or filling the silence with time with God, right? Here we see in Revelation, silence for 30 minutes. Maybe don't fill the silence, and maybe focus on not doing things that take you out of a mindset where you can spend some time with God. And the challenge would be don't worry about doing that all day. That's a big ask. But maybe a couple hours when you get home from church. Do nothing with God for a while, or very little, and see how that goes. In more or less silence would be very helpful, I think. And see how it goes. Because there is throughout the scripture, from the first 2 chapters of the book of Genesis to at least the 8th chapter of the book of Revelation, bookended on the Bible, this call that this is an important thing. And it's definitely not just at the beginning and the end, right? This is a central and key theme, the idea of Sabbath, of rest, of spending time in the presence of God. This is one of the key themes throughout the scriptures, and it is counterintuitive in that it's silent instead of talking, and that it's inactive instead of active. And those are the reason it's emphasized so much, is that that's so contrary to our nature, right? We want to fill the space with noise and activity. Even lazy people want to fill the space with noise and activity. It's different kinds of, we all are inclined to do it, and it pulls us away from God when we do it. So the idea of Sabbath and much of liturgy is about getting back to those things that draw us back into a place where we can be in the presence of God. So, not at all surprising, we're trying to achieve reconciliation and union between God and humanity. Let's start by stopping. Silence, nothing. And then once we're regrouped, we can more meaningfully and more purposefully start again. Moving forward now, we don't cease from activity forever, right? And we come to the end of a week. We have our Sabbath day, which in the Christian case is Sunday. And then Monday, we get back to work. We have now finished our 7 seals, capped off the 7th of them with a period of rest and inactivity. So now we move into 7 more things. This is so deliberate that this mirrors the shape of a week. We will get to why, because these don't look like time-bound events, right? It looks like, 7 seals, that's not 7 days. That's just take out my knife and break 7 things, and that happens in 5 minutes. But definitely not a day per thing. That is a silly way of looking at it. Why would that happen when the text doesn't say that it's 1 a day? And some of these events clearly take a lot more than a day, and some of them may be less. So it's definitely not days, and it's definitely not a week, except the last seal is the same as a Sabbath day that caps a week. So it is and it isn't, but it is a week. Even though it's happening in time that's not counted in revolutions of the sun, but opening of seals. It is very much a week. And that point is further reiterated by the fact that we get to the end and we're doing 7 more again. And spoiler alert, when we get to the end of that, we'll do 7 more again for a while. And that is itself, also spoiler, but I won't entirely spoil it, is a liturgical thing, rooted in a liturgical event that is reliant upon some passage of time. We'll get to what it is. You might be able to guess, and gold star if you can, but we're not trying to get ahead of ourselves. That's down the road. For now, time bound, even if it's not days. So we get through our 7 seals, we have our Sabbath seal, and now we're back to activity. We're starting a new series of events. 7 angels with 7 trumpets. The trumpets matter a great deal. We'll talk about it more when there's a little more text to go with it to provide some context. Right now, there's not probably enough here to figure out what's going on. The key point being we're starting a new series of things. We have every reason to believe, and it's going to get way more apparent as well, that these are very explicitly following the pattern of a week, which is intended to be so. And that it is all liturgical act, right? This is heaven, right? It's still the angels who stand before God. These trumpets are liturgical instruments as well, which we will dive into. As we start with this liturgical theme, we're really going to be hit over the head with it. This is where we're meant to make sure we understand that that's going on. It will be less clear later, but it doesn't stop. It's being drilled in now to make sure that we get it. So, to make sure that we're not missing that there is some liturgical action going on here, and its significance and who's involved, we are diving in a little. Another angel is coming and standing at the altar with a gold censer. Lots of moving parts there. First of all, how many angels did we already have? 7. What does it mean when we get then another one showing up? Hopefully this is very reminiscent in your minds to the beginning of the book of Revelation, right? When again you were in heaven and you had 7 things and then you had an 8th thing, and that made it a better thing. That is a repeating theme. If you think back, when we have had 7 things, we have had that Jesus-y 8th thing right nearby to make sure that we got that present. So we just had a 7th thing that didn't have an 8th thing, and now we're reminded, oh, when there's a 7th thing, there's meant to be an 8th thing. And it's there. So why is it conspicuously absent when we were opening these seals? We just had a 7th thing, and we didn't do the whole 8th thing. Why on earth would that be? And we have 7 trumpets, and spoiler, we're not going to have an 8th thing there either. What is happening? I'm not answering that question yet. Again, that's a future thing, but it should be standing out at this point, and hopefully it's raising some questions. So there's that. We get to an 8 number of angels, and this angel is very liturgical, right? Where is he standing? At the altar. Which altar? It turns out it's actually really helpful reading the more abstract and prophetic parts of the Bible to have a pretty good understanding in your head of the setup of the tabernacle or of the temple. Because otherwise there are a lot of references that are pretty easy to miss. It doesn't have to be super detailed, but it's good to have a general idea. For example, there were 2 altars. There's the altar of sacrifice that we talked about in connection with the earth itself in the previous lesson, square used for sacrificing animals on the outside of the temple or the tabernacle, because that's where you do your killing, and it makes a mess and it smells, and also because that is the act that happens there is one of initiation or admittance into the holy area where the really important thing happens, which is worshiping God. Okay, so you get into the courtyard by means of going past the altar of sacrifice, and then you get into the temple, it's even more restricted access, and then the Holy of Holies, even more restricted access. Right there in the middle of all of that action, where the holy things are, you have another altar. And this altar is not used for sacrifice. This is called the altar of incense. An altar is basically a table, right? It's not a killing table, it's just a table. The altar of sacrifice on the outside is a killing table because that's the function of the table. But it's because I have this big altar table that I'm going to use to sacrifice. So the altar part just means table, and the sacrifice part means killing. So then you get inside, you have another altar, a table of incense, not of killing. So you shouldn't think about every altar as a place where stuff is murdered or sacrificed. Only the ones that are for that. This other altar is for incense. What did incense do? Few functions. One, the practical one, it smells good. And when your liturgy involves no small amount of killing and carving up animals and burning them, there is going to be a smell. So by itself, something that smells good and strong is not a bad idea. Symbolically, that you burn incense here, and what happens to it? The flame, the heat, the smoke, carrying the smell of the incense rises up to heaven. And it smells sweet and pleasing. And so with that sweet, pleasing odor, your prayers rise to God. So again, to summarize, sacrifice on the outside gets you in. The important thing is you want to offer prayers to God. That happens without any kind of animal sacrifice. That just happens from this table that is sitting in the presence of God. What do you need to do it? You need incense and you need fire. You need, and they used a coal, right? They kept a hot coal there and you sprinkle some incense on, not unlike we do now. And that burned the incense and caused the prayers to go up. So there was the table that is the altar of incense basically held a heated coal. And then you bring the incense, put it on the altar, up it goes. Which is symbolic of, because that altar is near where the presence of God is of bringing your prayers into the presence of God, and they get carried up to God. It's beautiful imagery. Random question. I'm not going to dwell on this too much. It's just an interesting point of thought. Which is our altar in our churches? It commemorates the offering of a sacrifice, but we're not sacrificing an animal or Jesus. It very much has to do with carrying our prayers up to heaven. Incense is definitely offered around it as a part of that function. I think you can make a really strong argument that we combined the two altars into one and joined their function in our celebration of the Mass, which is why it's really easy for us as Catholics to miss that there are two altars, because we have one and it does both of those things. But they didn't. They had two, and they did different things. And so here we are having another angel, our eighth angel, who is, if you've been tracking, necessarily a very Jesus-y character, even if described as an angel, stands at the altar with a golden censer, thing holding the coal that because you can't just hold that with your hands. And he was given much incense to mingle with the prayers of all the saints upon the golden altar before the throne. And the smoke of the incense rose with the prayers of the saints from the hand of the angel before God. Even in heaven, we are offering prayers to God. We're not offering sacrifice. We are offering prayers as on the altar of incense. Which of those functions is more important? A spoiler, it's not the sacrifice. Which matters so much to us as Christians, because we focus probably you can't overemphasize the importance of the sacrifice, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. You cannot overstate the importance of that. But that, again, is the ticket to admittance, right? It's not what happens after that. And it's so easy to over-focus on the thing that gets you in the door and not on what you do after that. And what you do after that once you're Christian is the part that matters, not the thing that already got you your ticket. That matters surpassingly more than anything that will ever exist, right? The thing that gets you, fallen human, a ticket to heaven is the single most important thing that will ever be, for at least for us as humans. But once that's achieved, then what matters? It's not looking back at the sacrifice. You're in. Congratulations, you're in heaven. What do you do? And it's not dwelling on that sacrifice that got you in the door. It's the function now is one of prayer and worship, but especially of prayer. Think of how many of the saints have dedicated themselves to this idea of intercessory prayer and have dedicated, give or take, every waking moment of their lives to interceding for and praying for the world and people in particular. I don't know why I'm just thinking of this now, but Saint Therese of Lisieux, there are stories of her reading news about people in particular. I think there was one of potentially a convicted murderer, and for whatever reason she thought, I need to pray for this guy. And that became like the theme of her life for a significant period of time and ended up being a big deal in her life. And so many cases in the lives of the saints are these stories of committing themselves to prayer for the world and for people. That is an act that we can do that puts us well in line with the activity of heaven, is what we're seeing here. That is a heavenly thing we can do here on earth. And it's one that doesn't get emphasized enough. So what are they doing? They've got their angels with this eighth one, and what they're doing, the activity they're engaged in heaven, is offering the prayers of the saints up as incense, sweet smelling incense to God. Now something less familiar happens. We've been very rooted in various liturgical forms of the Old Testament. Hopefully that's been clear. This is less so. You have that Jesus the angel by the altar with the censer. He's taking the censer with fire from that altar, the thing used to carry the prayers into the presence of God. As the fire burns the incense, the censer and the coals communicate the prayers of the saints to God. Takes that coal, or even the whole censer, with the coal and the fire, and throws it down to the earth. What's going on with that? A few things. One, we talked about with the seal, or with the seals, we are preparing the earth for the coming of God. The earth is not ready for God yet, but here is a holy thing from inside of the inner area of heaven that is finding its way down to earth. It won't have the effect that God's presence would, but it seems that instead of the earth defiling this holy thing, the holy thing is changing the earth. It can go either way, right? When you start to break down those barriers between sacred things and non-sacred things, the usual course of action is that the sacred things become profane. But that is not always the case. Sometimes the sacred things sanctify the profane things. That's what's happening here, is you have this very holy thing that is capable of carrying prayers to God, that is entering into the earth. It's breaking down some of the separation between heaven and earth. If the earth, in essence, catches fire from this fire, then the whole earth is now a thing that is capable of communicating prayers up to God with the same fervor, the same fire that the censer on the golden altar in heaven is able to do. That is blasting those communication channels wide open between heaven and earth. That is a big accomplishment, a big deal. It doesn't come without tumult. From just this, however, it's not. The trumpets bring the real upheaval. Just the censer brings thunder, loud noises, flash of lightning, and an earthquake. It doesn't come with nothing, but it doesn't rock the foundations of the earth or anything. I guess literally with an earthquake it sort of does, but not in a way that it's like unmaking the world or anything. And not in the same extent as what we see when the trumpets are unleashed. This is sending something down before these trumpets start to blow so that the prayers of the earth can be communicated up to heaven. It's opening communication channels. There's a running joke about, or it appears in a lot of jokes, this idea that the Pope has a phone that goes straight to God, right? Figures into, the priest who confirmed me was a huge fan of making lots of corny jokes, many of them religious in nature, and a great many of them relied on the premise that the Pope had a phone he could pick up and talk to God. While that's obviously not true, that is essentially what's happening here with the censer coming down. It's like giving humanity a phone that goes straight to God. Before we get to what's about to happen with these trumpets, where we see our angels with their trumpets are making ready to blow them. Now we start to blow these trumpets. Before we talk specifically about what they're doing, let's talk about the idea of them being trumpets at all, and a little more broadly about what's happening. We teed all of this up really strongly as an act of liturgy, where our trumpets a necessary and an integral part of liturgy. This is another one of those things that is less familiar to those of us who are Christians, because this is all changed in form and isn't as it was. So it's a reference that can be missed. There is a very important Jewish feast coinciding with the New Year that commemorates primarily the entry into and taking possession of the Promised Land, which happened. The people came into the Promised Land. As it turns out, if you just show up at a place where other people are already living and you say, God promised me that this is my place now, that the people who already live there might not agree. And you might have a difference of opinion that you have to resolve, which is what happened when these Israelites who had been wandering in the desert for 40 years finally arrived in the Promised Land. The existing inhabitants did not agree that they should take possession of the land. And so the thing that so often in human history comes to pass came to pass, and they had to have a little dispute and settle who was going to own the land. And there was a very well fortified fortress in the city of Jericho that basically was the thing that stood between the people of Israel and inheriting the land that God had promised them. And the defining feature of this fortress was its big, thick, strong walls. And so, of course, when the Israelites said, hey, give us the land, the people with the fortress said, I don't think so. Take it if you can. And so they prayed to God and for help. And God said, here's the plan. It's the best plan ever, and this is definitely how you conquer fortresses. I want you to take the ark, and for 7 days in a row, you're going to do laps around the city. And on the first 6 of those days, you're going to be quiet when you do it. And then on the 7th day, you're going to blow trumpets very loudly. And if memory serves, they do 7 laps on the last day, I think. And the walls are going to fall down. Easy enough. And then you can take possession of the land that has been promised to you by me, God, from these people that have the gall to not just hand over their land to you. And that's what happens. And that is a huge deal because it's a start. It's the beginning of the people's living in this land that was promised so long ago to Abraham, but Abraham never possessed it. He lived there, but he didn't own the land. It's only when they come back and conquer that they take possession of the land that God promised to them. So this is a beginning, right? And that comes to be why Rosh Hashanah, the Feast of Trumpets, becomes the Jewish New Year, right? It's the beginning. We're moving past and out of where we were and into a new thing, and that happens with the blowing of trumpets, which breaks down walls and creates cause for celebration. So we're doing that again. What are some of the moving parts here? Where are the walls, and what is the land that has been promised? And it's easier to start probably with what is the land that has been promised, because of course the promised land was not the kingdom of Israel, it was heaven. And as it turns out, more broadly, heaven on earth. As Revelation is telling us, it's not just rest in heaven, but the whole earth itself becomes the promised land. And the walls, more than anything in that context, end up being us. We are the barriers preventing the promised land from coming to earth. Our own sin, our own impurity, our own uncleanliness are ultimately the barriers preventing the realization of the true promised land, which ties in so excellently with the Jewish feast of Rosh Hashanah, because it starts a 10-day period that builds up to Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. You start your year by reflecting on making atonement for your sins so that you can get a fresh, clean start in the new year. What a great idea. So here, if we are blowing trumpets, then we're entering a period, day 1, leading up to atonement, day 10, yet to come. We're entering this period of atonement. And the idea is to break down those barriers, which are our own sins and impurity, that separate us from God, not so we can go up to God in heaven, but so God can come down on earth to spend with us. So you see a beautiful melding here of the events at Jericho, of the Jewish liturgy of Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. That purity was further emphasized by that censer coming down from the presence of God. And where we're going, this is assembling all of those pieces of that puzzle together. And the picture you get, as I alluded to in the intro, is one of liturgy, is one of worship of God. And that becomes so much more clear here. So that's one of the moving parts. as we're blowing trumpets. The other one is this bears resemblance to acts in time. And there is, as we will see, it'll become more clear as we get through various trumpets. It's less clear on this first one. We are echoing the days of creation with the blowing of the trumpets. What's happening is only affecting a third of things, but it's affecting the things that were done in the days of creation. So the first one here, it's the vegetation on the earth, which was set up on the third day of creation, right? It will be worth, I'm going to review what happens on the first 6 days I'll just do all 7 days of creation here, so it's fresh in all of our heads as we're talking about this. The first day, fiat lux, let there be light, and there was light. The second day, there was the view at the time that all creation came from like an endless body of water. And God took, on the second day, that body of water and separated out from it sky. So you had water above and you had water below. Third day, you take the water below, you separate that out, you get some dry land, and you get vegetation on the dry land. Fourth day, so that's a sequence of 3, and then on the second set of 3 days, you're going to fill in, and you're going to do things that interact with what you did on the previous day 3 days ago. So first day, let there be light. Fourth day, you've got sun, moon, and stars, because they didn't, have the understanding that those things are, especially the sun and the stars, are the things that create light. This is an image and a metaphor, and not really a description of how all things came to be and scientifically how they work. So fourth day, sun, moon, stars. You're filling in that infrastructure of the light. Fifth day, birds, fishes, and sea monsters. You're filling in with life those things that you did on the second day, right? When you carved out that dome, you had sky, you had sea. Then you put life in the sky and in the sea. Sixth day, on the third day, you carved out that land. On the sixth day, you had animals and you had people, living things. And then, of course, you rest on that seventh day, which tends to then look like an infrastructure meant to hold another eighth thing. We've talked about it. We'll talk about it again. For now, the important part is what happens on the 6th. So each of these trumpets is going to affect some of the things that occurred in the days of creation, tying the blowing of the trumpets to the days of creation. It's not in order, but it's worth further emphasizing the time-bound nature of the blowing of these trumpets, right? They come to resemble the act of days. So you're not just blowing 7 trumpets, but you have a very day-like passage of time as you're blowing them as well. And then you are breaking down some of creation, right? Like a third of creation in these various areas is being broken down by what's happening here. As you break down the walls of Jericho with the blowing of the trumpets, you're breaking down a third of creation, which apparently is incompatible with the presence of God. So the first one, you're dealing with the vegetation and the things on the land. Second trumpet, second angel, second day. Great mountain is thrown into the sea. This is something that affects the sea, the thing that is carved out in the second day of creation, and the 5th, because the sea becomes like blood, and the living creatures in it, a third of them die, and the ships. Really no more involved than that. First day, affecting vegetation and things on land. Second day, things in the sea, most especially the acts of the 5th day of creation. Then we blow the third trumpet from the third angel. A star falls from heaven into the rivers and the fresh water, called wormwood. And wormwood is a poison. It's bitter, but it's also a poison that makes water undrinkable. What's the difference between fresh water and salt water? Fresh water is drinkable. What's the difference between fresh water and salt water if you make the fresh water undrinkable? Not much. Strictly speaking, one has salt and one has poison in it, but functionally speaking, both are undrinkable. So you have taken the act of the third day of creation, where you separate out dry land from the sea, and the water on the dry land is fresh versus the water in the sea is salted, and you're rolling that back. Now you are, in essence, you're re-salting or recombining with the sea in function a third of the fresh water on the land. Now we have the fourth angel, fourth trumpet. I almost just said on the fourth day. Fourth day. Easy one. Fourth day of creation is the thing that is being mirrored. The sun, the moon, and the stars that were added on that fourth day of creation. A third of those are going away as well. So we have echoed in reverse some of the acts of creation, tying us to days, suggesting a relationship between what's happening not only with the week but with creation itself. There is, we saw a little bit of reference to it, not a lot. There is the unfortunate addition to the fact that when things were originally created, people were added at the end after all the heavy lifting was done. And here, people are around for all of it, which makes this not unmurderous to some of the people on the earth. We talked a lot about that with the seals as well, right? Repetition of the theme. You can't have that kind of upheaval with people on the earth without it having a deleterious effect on the people, a number of the people on the earth. And this is where we also start to see, although strictly speaking from a narrative point of view, this is coming after the events of the seal. Of the seals, it ends up being kind of the same thing, and we finished one week and we started a new week. You could argue that we're looking at the same sequence of events and activity from a different perspective. And so this particular perspective focuses less on what's happening to the people. That comes a lot more later. And a lot more on what's happening to the world. Various boundaries in the world are breaking down. There's a resetting of creation as we're rolling a few things back to take another step forward. And we'll see how a lot of that goes because we're not done with blowing trumpets yet. We're right in the middle here. But more to come. Both of these, by the way, started with a fourfold thing and then had a threefold thing after, right? In the seals, we had our four horsemen kicking things off, and then we had three additional things. Here we've got four trumpets mirroring days of creation, and then we're going to have more trumpets not mirroring days of creation as clearly. And so we end up with, again, in case anyone were inclined to miss it, we're mirroring and repeating very explicitly what happened with the seals, which again I think argues for mashing those two things together as advancing a similar theme that may overlap in time. And I say that and will continue to repeat because I think there is a very serious danger here of trying to draw a chronological narrative across all of these things that happen in Revelation. I think that road leads to peril. in terms of your understanding of the book of Revelation. So many people have done that, and they try to lay out, these are the signs of the end times, and first you'll see this, and then you'll see this, and then you'll see that. And look at the things that happen, right? Like, okay, so I don't have to worry about God coming to claim my soul until a third of all heavenly bodies disappear. Great. Then I have lots of time, and I'll know, and I don't have to worry about it, and I can live my heathen life. Because maybe I'll miss all the fish and creatures in the ocean and ships dying. Maybe I'll miss a great mountain burning with fire thrown into the sea somehow. I think it would probably be on the news. Maybe I'll miss a whole bunch of the drinkable water becoming bitter and killing people. I definitely won't miss a bunch of stars going out. I think I'll know when this is coming, and the book of Revelation told me that comes before the stuff later about everybody being called to account for their behavior. So worst case, I have a sign that I can look for that'll clearly indicate that it's time to get my act together. No, please don't do that, right? So, and that's part of the peril here of trying to look at these things as a clear narrative following sequentially in time. We'll keep talking about it, but for now, let's do away with the idea that that's the thing here. And that it's very, very possible that time is layered in how we're looking at this. And some things like the judgment of humanity could even happen before the darkening of a third of the stars in the sky. And do you really want to risk falling on the wrong side because you don't know? This isn't giving you a roadmap to follow the exact temporal sequence of the end of creation. This is reassembling images from the Old Testament to paint a liturgical picture of what the end of time looks like. A liturgical picture, not like a news story describing in sequence all of the events that happen. It's not that. This is a liturgical description. And anybody who's tried to read the Germ or something knows that could be a little obtuse. And that the events of the liturgy, although they're in parts and they sort of happen sequentially, revisit the same core principles and themes from different points of view as well, right? Our Mass does that as well. And it's all different directions and channels leading to the same thing there as well. And although it sort of happens sequentially in time, it sort of doesn't, because it calls into reality a thing from the past and makes it present now. And it also connects with the future. The Mass itself likewise muddies the passage and presence of space and time, as this does. Liturgy does that. And so, again, don't look at this as a sequential roadmap. We'll talk some about the timing and see what we can figure out from it. But this is different times and spaces present together in an act that is liturgical. Here we take a short pause. I shouldn't call it a respite or an intermission, however, since the message is far from peaceful or restful. Here we see an eagle flying in mid-heaven, so not in the sky, not in like the God place of heaven, but like the sky kind of heaven. Just an eagle flying around the sky saying, now you're really gonna get it. Whoa, 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 to those who dwell on the earth. At what's about to happen. You thought these first 4 trumpets were bad. This next part, whoa. This is not what you want to see. This is not going to be fun. So that leaves us again on a bit of a cliffhanger. expecting something very significant yet to come. So significant that the people of earth were forewarned. So having reached the end of the lesson, we will see what that is about in the next one. This has been an overview of Lesson 9 of the Turning to God's Word Bible Study, The Revelation of Jesus Christ, the Faithful Witness. For more information, consult our written study and visit us online at turningtogodsword.com.